There was a time when his name struck absolute fear into anyone who heard it. Known as the Night Governor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Kumarin wasn't just a mafia boss. He controlled the government, dominated the oil market, and ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist. His empire, the Tambov Mob, became the most powerful criminal syndicate of its time, crushing rivals, bribing officials, and seizing entire industries. For Kumarin, business was war, and no one who stood in his way was left standing for long. His ruthless deals and secret operations made him many enemies. Wars, betrayals, assassination attempts, Kumarin faced them all. But before he was a mafia boss, before the power, the money, and the violence, Kumarin was nothing. He came from the very bottom of society. His rise is one of the rare cases where a man climbs from absolute poverty to the peak of wealth and power. Kumarin's story is at times inspiring, but also chilling. It's a brutal example of what happens when greed, ambition, and violence are left unchecked. So let's go back to the beginning, to February 15th, 1956, when a young Vladimir Kumarin was born into poverty. In 1956, deep in the Soviet countryside, in a village that barely appeared on a map, Vladimir Kumarin was born. His mother was a milkmaid on a collective farm. His father operated heavy machinery. Life was hard, food was scarce, and there was little hope for something better. However, hardship made Kumarin ambitious. He didn't want to be a farmer or a factory worker. He wanted more. After serving in the Soviet army, he was accepted into a university in St. Petersburg. But school wasn't for him. He skipped classes, worked odd jobs, and chased money instead of grades. He found his real education somewhere else, working as a bouncer at one of the city's top restaurants. This wasn't just any job. This was where the rich and the powerful gathered, and Kumarin was smart enough to know that making the right connections mattered more than any university degree. People started coming to him, not for a table, but for help, settling disputes, collecting debts, enforcing deals. It was the late 1980s and the Soviet Union was falling apart. In those days, force spoke louder than law, and Kumarin understood that better than anyone. In 1985, at 29 years old, Kumarin was arrested, suspected of murder. Police couldn't prove it, but they found enough on him to send him away for hooliganism and theft charges. For most, prison is a punishment, but for Kumarin, it was a promotion. Outside, he was a small-time enforcer. Inside, he became something more, respected, connected, untouchable. By 1986, he was out, and this time, he had bigger plans. Young men, hungry for money and power, started gathering around him. This was the beginning of what would become the Tambov Mob. The first fortune of the Tambov Mob didn't come from drugs, weapons, or smuggling. It came from something much simpler: the shell game. With no casinos in the Soviet Union, people gambled in the streets. Under Kumarin's control, the shell game turned into an empire. But gambling was just the beginning. The fall of the Soviet Union changed everything. Suddenly, people were making money. Businesses flourished. But there were no laws, no police protection, and merchants had to pay for security. Kumarin's security. Refusing to pay had consequences. Violence wasn't a threat, it was a certainty. Blood and fear kept the money flowing. And soon, the Tambov Mob ruled St. Petersburg. The mob would soon discover, however, that the real money was in smuggling. Between 1991 and 1994, Russia saw an explosion of illegal trade. Copper, aluminum, lead. The Tambov Mob evolved from small-time enforcers to a powerful criminal enterprise. They weren't just making money, they were taking over entire industries. The money got bigger, the power grew stronger, and what happened next would turn the Tambov Mob from feared criminals into a force that would shake Russia's economy to its core. By 1994, St. Petersburg was drowning in crime. The streets were no longer the only battleground. The real power was in government offices, boardrooms, and oil terminals. And at the center of it all was the Tambov Mob. Russia was in chaos. Corruption was sky high, the government was weak, and Kumarin, hungry for more, saw the perfect opportunity: the oil market. If he could control oil, he wouldn't just be a mafia boss, he'd be unstoppable. But to pull this off, Kumarin needed the right people, men with connections, influence, and no morals. And Dmitry Skigin was exactly that. He wasn't just the Tambov Mob's financier. He was their key to European banking, the guardian of their offshore fortune. By the late 1990s, Skigin had built a network of offshore shell companies across Europe. Later, he secured a Greek passport and moved to Monaco, one of the world's safest havens for dirty money. But even Monaco, a place where money laundering is practically an art form, had had enough. On May 19, 2000, Skigin was officially deported. Let that sink in. He was too dirty for Monaco. Skigin made his first move to take over the oil market in 1995 when he saw a chance to get control of an oil depot at the port of St. Petersburg. With the right connections, it could become a valuable asset. But to take full control, they needed approval from the city. That's when he turned to Deputy Mayor of St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin. Skigin made several visits to the mayor's office, lobbying for a 20-year lease on the oil depot. In reality, there was only one real objective: ensuring the right company got the contract. And just like that, he got exactly what he wanted. The deputy mayor signed the deal, and with the ink dry, the Tambov Mob now controlled a key part of Russia's fuel infrastructure. No more street hustling. No more gambling rackets. This was high-level organized crime, protected, legitimized, and backed by the power of the state. To run the operation, the Tambov Mob needed a company, so Skigin created one, Sovex. But this wasn't the first time he'd used that name. A few years earlier, Skigin had taken over a company called Sovex, a timber business owned by a German entrepreneur. But in St. Petersburg in the early 90s, business takeovers weren't done with lawyers and contracts, they were done with threats and with violence. The German owner didn't just lose his company, he barely made it out alive. And with control over the timber Sovex, Skigin created a second Sovex, this time focused on oil, a business far more dangerous and far more profitable. Officially, the oil Sovex had two owners. Skigin controlled 66% through his company Sigma, and the remaining 34% belonged to Horizon International Trading, an offshore entity based in Liechtenstein. But in reality, the entire structure was controlled by the Tambov Mob, and specifically Kumarin. Like most offshore companies, its real owners remained hidden. But in St. Petersburg, everyone knew exactly whose money was flowing through it. In Liechtenstein, the man who ensured secrecy for the Tambov Mob was an Englishman named Graham Smith. Smith was a professional nominee director, a figure who fronted dozens of companies, allowing their real owners to stay in the shadows. And for years, he was the public face of Horizon International Trading. In 2000, Skigin's deportation from Monaco exposed the real owners of Horizon. Authorities confirmed that Skigin and his father controlled the company. Horizon wasn't just an offshore company, it was a money laundering machine, moving millions for the Tambov Mob. But Smith's past was just as interesting. Before becoming a key figure in Russian mafia money laundering, he had an entirely different role. He was a distributor of Soviet communist literature in England. Somehow, he went from spreading ideology to managing offshore slush funds in one of the world's most secretive banking havens. His name first gained attention in 1990 when he was linked to the collapse of London United Investments, an English insurance company. Before its bankruptcy, 60 million euros mysteriously disappeared, funneled into one of Smith's Liechtenstein companies. The money was never recovered. By the mid-1990s, Smith had found a new clientele: Russian gangsters. His partnership with Skiggin became the backbone of the Tambov Mob's financial operations in Europe. Together, they controlled offshore networks, laundered millions, and ensured that the mob's money flowed smoothly through Western banking systems. Sovex, established in 1994, was a front for the Tambov Mob's fuel business. On paper, it was just another private company, but in reality, it helped the mob take control of St. Petersburg's fuel market. Between 1994 and 1996, the Tambov Mob was in a brutal war for control of the city's fuel market, and Sovex was the weapon they used to win the fight, and more. First in 1995, Sovex played a key role in taking over the oil depot at the port of St. Petersburg. Then in 1996, the mob set their sights on something even bigger, the fuel depot at Pulkovo Airport. Pulkovo is St. Petersburg's only major airport. Its fuel depot is a vital refueling complex for airplanes, and it was state-owned. But what if it was leased out? What if a private company could control every drop of fuel that went into every plane? That is exactly what happened. Sovex gained control of Pulkovo's fuel supply, creating a private monopoly at a state-owned airport. And since Pulkovo was an international hub, this monopoly wasn't just lucrative, it was a goldmine of foreign currency. And where did that money go? Definitely not to Russia. Foreign airlines were instructed to make payments for kerosene directly to Horizon International Trading, the Tambov Mob's offshore company in Liechtenstein. A perfect setup for laundering millions and dodging taxes. Between 1996 and 2001, Sovex funneled $600 million to Europe, an average of $120 million per year. Every time a plane refueled at Pulkovo, the profits flowed straight to the Mafia's offshore accounts. Unlike the protection rackets of the mob's early days, gaining control of Pulkovo Airport wasn't done through brute force. The airport was city property, and all decisions related to it went through the St. Petersburg mayor's office. Fuel sector matters were handled by Deputy Mayor Vladimir Putin. On May 17, 1996, Putin signed an order leasing Pulkovo's refueling complex to Sovex. Shortly after, the final lease agreement was in place. With that signature, the Tambov Mob secured full control over the airport's fuel supply. But what did Putin get in return? According to rumors, he initially asked for 15% of Sovex's profits, around $18 million per year, but the mob negotiated him down to 4%. However, like most illegal agreements, this wasn't documented anywhere. Instead, his payments were routed through Horizon International Trading in Liechtenstein. Pulkovo was just one victory, but Kumarin had even bigger ambitions. Taking an airport was one thing. Taking an entire industry was another. In late 1994, Vladimir Kumarin made a decision. He was going to own it all. Every gas station, oil depot, refinery, maritime refueling hub, Pulkovo's refueling complex, the entire fuel market in northwest Russia would belong to the Tambov Mob. The plan was simple: build a criminal monopoly where no fuel moved without their cut. And they had the muscle and connections to make it happen. But there was a problem. Surgutneftgaz. Being one of Russia's largest oil companies, they had no intention of sharing their assets with the criminals. But the Tambov Mob didn't want a share, they wanted it all. And the methods used to achieve their goal were anything but legal. Between 1994 and 1996, the mob got to work, leaning on competitors, buying off officials, and making sure every key asset ended up under their control. The takeover of St. Petersburg's fuel market was a well-coordinated operation involving the Tambov Mob and key officials in the government. The mayor's office was the most helpful in taking over the assets of Surgutneftgaz. With a proper marketing campaign of crisis in the oil market, the mayor's office took ownership of Surgutneftgaz's assets in the region and created a company named the Petersburg Fuel Company, which was handed to the Tambov Mob. In the end, everything fell into place. The Tambov Mob's takeover of the fuel market was a success, carried out under the banner of the newly created Petersburg Fuel Company. They split the oil depot at the seaport into two companies, Baltic Bunker, handling ship refueling, and St. Petersburg Oil Terminal, controlling the oil exports. At Pulkovo Airport, it was the same story. Sovecs took over refueling, turning every plane into another source of revenue for the mob. The Kurishi oil refinery, the biggest in the region, was given to a group of former security officers known as the Timchenko Group, running a company called Kinex. Today, Gennady Timchenko is one of the wealthiest oligarchs in Russia, but back then, his group was just another piece of the Tambov Mob's growing empire. The mob now controlled both fuel distribution across the region and the largest refinery producing it, and every step of the way, the necessary approvals came from one place, the St. Petersburg mayor's office, signed off by Vladimir Putin. By 1996, the takeover was complete. The Tambov Mob controlled 100 gas stations, 22 small oil depots, the oil depot at the port, Pulkovo Airport refueling, the Kurishi oil refinery, and many more. The takeover of the fuel market between 1994 and 1996 was a turning point for St. Petersburg's criminal world. The fight for oil and fuel transformed the Tambov Mob into something much bigger. Back in the late 1980s, the Tambov Mob was nothing more than a group of street racketeers running shell games and shaking down businesses and brawling in bars, just another criminal brigade with a strongman leader. But by the mid-1990s, it had evolved into something far more dangerous, a coalition of multiple gangs all working together like a corporation. Most importantly, the mob had absorbed its most valuable ally, the St. Petersburg mayor's office. This gave them something no street gang could dream of: total protection from the law. But nothing can last forever. But before we get to that, let's take a quick break so I can ask for a small favor. If you're liking this video, please don't forget to tap the notification bell for Dirty Digits. We create mini documentaries on financial crimes, money laundering, fraud, and much more. But just subscribing doesn't guarantee you'll see them, so make sure to turn on the notifications to stay updated. I'd really appreciate it. And with that out of the way, let's get back to the fall of the Tambov Mob. By the late 1990s, the Tambov Mob had reached the height of its power. It controlled fuel, trade, real estate, and government contracts, operating like a corporation with a mafia core. But like all criminal empires, it was never meant to last. In 2006, Vladimir Kumarin, the night governor of St. Petersburg, was nearly assassinated. He survived, but lost his arm, a brutal reminder of how quickly power can shift. Kumarin was hungry for more. He wanted to control the government itself. He saw Russia's weak political and economic state as an opportunity, using violence, money, and influence to push himself further up the chain. But for politicians, he was an outsider, a glitch in the system. And the system always fixes the glitch. In 2008, Kumarin was arrested and charged with organized crime, fraud, and extortion. The empire he built turned against him. The court sentenced him to 23 years in prison. But the Tambov Mob didn't disappear. They had already moved into legal business. Their money had been laundered, invested, and hidden in offshore accounts, European banks, and luxury real estate. The mob adapted, shifting from street violence to high finance, from criminal networks to corporate power. One of their former associates, Gennady Timchenko, who gained control over the Kurishi oil refinery, is now one of Russia's wealthiest oligarchs. He dominates the oil and energy sector, an empire that once belonged to the Tambov Mob. But the biggest transformation wasn't in the mob. It was in the man who signed their deals. The deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, who quietly approved the Tambov Mob's expansion in the 1990s, would go on to become the most powerful figure in Russia: Vladimir Putin. Today, he is the president of Russia. And he didn't just survive the game, he won it. Every country has its own mob, but in Russia, the mob owns the whole country. The Tambov Mob's legacy still shapes modern Russia. The Mafia state system they created never collapsed, it evolved. Because in the end, crime never really disappears. It just moves into boardrooms, government offices, and presidential palaces. The empire is gone, but the power structure remains, and the game continues.